Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As is always, it's my pleasure to have back with me today from Hawaii, Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. It's always my pleasure.
Charles, I'm showing here our agenda for this session. We're going to be talking about services today as an element of what is always economically referred to as goods and services. For our new listeners, and as a reminder, these are not interviews, but rather a monthly discussion between Charles and myself on something we both feel is important. And as such, I will today be primarily leading the discussion, and Charles will be jumping in as we go. Let me kick this off, Charles, with this slide in the way of a historical context. 20 years ago, we fundamentally had a revolution in the way we sourced goods. Corporations downsized, they right-sized, and increasingly outsourced. Globalization exploded as corporations went offshore and built global supply chains to initially capitalize on labor arbitrage. But this has led to economic development in emerging economies and a massive build-out of the global supply infrastructure. And we've talked about this in previous shows. This has resulted in goods versus services, but goods getting steadily cheaper, or minimally at least being able to absorb global inflation pressures. Now, more recently, as we see here, we have seen on the left, the distribution of those corporate goods mutate from, and I'm talking about distribution, not the manufacturing in the supply chain here, but this distribution has mutated the retailing of it to corporate mall chains, to the whole advent of big boxes, retailers, stores, and now we're completely revolutionizing all of that again with online retailing. And it has been dramatic, but what it is also doing is it's keeping costs and prices down. The beneficiary of this has been the consumer. And CPI and most official inflation measures have reflected this. And we'll comment on that a little bit further. But what hasn't been truly understood is the dramatic change the consumer has gone through. Jobs are demanding, commutes are involved, spouses normally work, and life is hectic. So today families are using, as you can see here on the right, are using and dependent on consumer services to a degree that a generation ago weren't available or used for convenience, and ways of saving the one thing everyone is completely short of besides money is time. So on the right is a list of just some of those services that we all need, and I mean need, and use today in a significant fashion. Any comments on anything so far, Charles?
Yes, Gordon. I want to just sort of add a little context to our discussion, which I think is really important, which is, for the past decade, you and I and everyone else who's been attempting to explain what's going on with the economy at this level, we've been asked by readers and listeners, well, what's going to happen? Are we going to get inflation or are we going to get deflation? And so there's this debate about the deflationary forces that you describe, in goods and the supply chain and overproduction of goods globally. Then there's these inflationary dynamics. And I'm really excited by today's discussion because you're providing some clarity here about how we can have both deflation and inflation and what the impact that will have on the household.
Exactly, and maybe even some of the misunderstanding we have with some of the media reporting on things that's going on. That's a big part of what's leading to the confusion of whether we're going to have inflation, deflation, or in what form. And as you correctly point out, we're having both, but we don't recognize it as such. Let me jump to the next slide here, Charles. So, what I see is our financial world is centered on corporations and Wall Street, and that's all we hear about. But to a large degree, this stops on the left-hand side of the chart. Though in the end, everybody and the corporations are all held hostage to the consumer's disposable income, that house in the middle. And in a 70% consumption economy, which we have in the United States, I think it's actually 68% today, it's critically important. Specifically, what a household spends its monies on is the essence of the economy. But we don't seem to pay attention quite the right way. The Main Street economy is on the right. It is actually the real economy in your community and everything you see and you feel and you touch, and for that matter, in my opinion, for America. And if you don't agree with that, at least in a much bigger fashion than ever before. The left side is about, and this is what it's important to recognize, the left side is about imported goods, which, as we've discussed, has become mostly deflationary in nature over the last 30 years. The right side is about domestic services, and their services, and these have been anything but deflationary. And they're typically not necessarily large corporations. They're local, they're small, they're smaller groups. And therefore, an employee is a very precious item, and they hate to lose them, and they're hard to attract, and their skills are, in many cases, almost irreplaceable in knowing the local market, the local customers, etc. So they have tremendous leverage that's not truly appreciated today, especially in the degree we move to domestic services. So we don't need to talk about here in this chart how our CPI measures, how we're measuring inflation. And we could get into discussions we have in the past about how it's being manipulated with, hedonics, imputation, substitution, amongst other statistical gimmicks that are really used to hold down the interest rates, or at least inflation, how it's reported for if no other reason, COLA payments to all the retirees, etc. But rather, what is really wrong with the whole process, if that's not bad enough, is that the basket itself hasn't changed properly. It doesn't actually reflect in any basket I go through the degree to which we now spend our money on all these, for example, all these services, or how they're not just their percentages, what they really are. Some of the major categories, yes, but not all, not to the degree they should be. And so also major goods, and this is a point we had talked about, Charles, the major goods are financed. And they're financed with low interest rates, and this has made them even cheaper. But on the other hand, services are something we pay cash for, and we put it on our credit card, and often end up, I guess, paying financing, because a lot of people paying north of 20% plus on credit card fees, and they're phenomenally high, but we pay cash. So, and of course those credit card fees and everything else aren't really properly allocated in that basket either. But looking at the size of the credit balances, it's eating disposable income alive today. You agree with that, Charles? So you're saying the same thing, right?
Right, exactly. And I want to make a little comment here on the way that you've broken out the domestic services by the trades, professions, and institutions. And one of the things that I've been trying to address is that we're getting inflation in two different kinds of services. We have what I call like the state cartel institutional services of higher education, lower education, hospital, and healthcare. Those are run by either government run institutions or government controlled or influenced institutions. And so these are huge, corporate structures, whether they're public universities or private universities or public hospitals or private hospitals. These are huge institutional service organizations, and their prices, as we all know, have been skyrocketing for decades, right? I mean, healthcare's just keeps going higher. Higher education, college tuition and fees keeps going higher. But then the other side of the trades and professionals, these are all, as you say, very small, mostly self-employed or very small businesses, and yet they're under the same sort of price pressure. So, it's interesting that you can't say that the institutions are the only source of high inflation, because it's your yard service, it's your childcare. All of those local small businesses are also having to raise their prices to keep their head above water. So we're getting a feedback loop that's both at the large scale and the small scale.
Yeah, it frustrates me every time I find the bill went up, but when I really think about it for my services, there's a reason. They're trying to survive, and their costs are going up in significant ways. And especially with the smaller businesses, where they don't have the real leverage. That's one of the issue with the services. They just don't have the leverage where they can be that much more productive. It's by the nature it's labor intensive, right? Whereas different to automation. But moving to the next slide here, Charles, labor is rates, wages is rising. If you really start to pull it apart for the trades and the skilled professions. I didn't say going up dramatically, but it has steadily been rising, at least here in the last 8 or 9 years. But for the vast majority of our society, wages haven't kept up with even this I'll call it phony CPI. But they still need the services of the labor where wages are rising. And here the issue is the statistical average makes a mockery out of really what is occurring, because there's just vastly more people that are having to work fast foods, retail, whatever, at a minimum wage, $12, $15 an hour, and therefore have to work 2 and 3 jobs to even get by, because the wages aren't going up. But the other professionals or trades have one job, and they're being able so far to at least keep their head above the water. But as the chart here shows, their wages have been steadily, almost accelerating a little bit as the economy has, as you would expect, has been picking up. And it is shocking that to me, that with the labor participation rate at historic lows, we actually have a labor shortage. And what we have is a mismatch. There are many reasons for this, and some of which I tried to list here. And I'd go into them, but that's a long discussion. You want to make any comments on any of those, Charles, reasons?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that I think it's important that we mention that labor is in a surplus in certain categories of the lower skills, and we're seeing this lower skill workers coming back into the economy, right? But the real inflationary pressure comes from the higher skilled services that usually require some government licensing often,
Yes.
or
Yes.
they have a lot of they pay a lot of taxes or fees, and they have they're exposed, like a CPA office or childcare. They're exposed to tremendous regulatory burdens, and that if unless you're in small business or self-employed, you may not be aware of how many costs are heaped on small business that have nothing to do with actually the money that flows into the owner's wallet. You know, that they have tremendous overhead and regulatory burdens, and so they've got to keep raising their prices. And so that's a cycle that it's really not going to be affected if there's more college graduates, because it's one thing to have the diploma, it's another thing to actually be able to run a small business in a very complicated regulatory environment.
Charles, you're absolutely on a huge point. I don't know how many times I hear some element of the services talking about fees, licenses, certification, compliance costs, re-education, regulatory re-education because of shifts that are just eating into their costs, are driving their costs up, that they're having to absorb, and they can't because they don't have the cash to do it. So they've got to pass them on without question.
Right, and it's also very important that you brought up demographics, because that's a huge a factor. You know, that 65 million baby boomers, as they retire, they're taking their skill set with them, and the training that was once considered standard is now lacking. You know, many corporations would rather poach talented labor from some other competitor rather than train in-house. And as soon as they train the people in-house, then they're poached by a competitor. So
I don't want to date myself, Charles, but this whole training. If you're younger, I'm getting a little older. If you're younger, you have no comprehension of the way it used to be. When I first started out after graduating, postgraduate, I went out and I joined the IBM Corporation. They sent me to school, private school, that is an IBM institution, for 1 year before they would allow me to actually be out there near a customer. Now, maybe I'm a slow learner, but that was the kind of training that corporations did that they felt was absolutely mandatory. The military still does it in terms of training, etc. But if you go around to any company, any corporation, they can't afford it. They don't do it. They poach, as you correctly, or they just bring them in and they're not trained. Which is in itself a series of issues. But the amount of training that used to be done by the corporations has just gone away. So, and with things changing so quickly, and people being and tasks being obsoleted so quickly, that training is even more important. And it's being happened on the fly. That creates problems. That creates costs in our system. Now, just to keep going here with time here, Charles, I want to get a little academic here for a second, and I apologize. Many of you, I'm sure, our listeners, hope you'd never see another supply-demand diagram after you left college, and I'll therefore keep this extremely simple, and therefore I've even made our lines here straight. They're not even curved in terms of demand and supply, but I want to make a whole point of what's been going on in our era of quantitative easing. And I'll get back to what's going to happen, in my opinion, with the inflation. And you'll no doubt recall that basic price theory suggests that demand volumes traditionally increase when prices increase, and conversely, supply normally increases when you have higher prices that can be taken from the market by what we now call the supply chain. In the most simplistic form, what happened, and we've had almost a decade now, certainly 8 years of global quantitative easing in some form or fashion, whether it's Japan's QQE, whether it's T-Litro in Europe, or even a different form in terms of China's infusion of liquidity. We've had a significant, what it's meant is global QE, quantitative easing, has significantly increased both demand and supply. Cheap money not only allowed consumers to buy more through credit, but allowed global supply chains to explode in both size and scope, so that supply growth has far outstripped, in my opinion, when I travel, is what I see, demand growth, as every corporate PowerPoint presentation showed them growing through increasing capture of more and more market share. Demand was, but what we need to understand, I've said this many times, is that quantitative easing is nothing more than bringing demand forward. There's something on the other side of that. It's called a hole. While supply went up exponentially, and to bring it back is a whole other discussion. And unfortunately, there are two central problems here. The demand created is mostly fundamentally, as I said, future demand brought forward. You don't have to save to get what you wanted. You could get it now. This would suggest, there was this gigantic demand hole that has been created, unless the powers to be can create new demand. And the question is, would more easy money actually achieve this? How cheap would money have to be to sustain and push this demand higher? And secondly, maybe even more profound, and this is what's troubling to me, is the increase in supply itself, and why we need these demand supply curves, because even before slowing in demand, global suppliers have already been facing a global trade war, a lack of pricing power, and the impact of growing numbers, and I've written about this, as you well know, Charles, the number of zombie corporations. Bank of International Settlement says it's now at 20% because they're cutting prices to stay alive and keep walking, and that profits or EBITDA can't even match in these corporations their historically low debt payments. This is what they're doing to survive, and as a result, supply is not proportionally being cut back while demand is falling. and we're continuing to see global product deflation. And as demand has come down, supply has been able to absorb, they've tried to absorb the costs. And so what we're really now seeing is an earnings recession as a result of it. A little long-winded, but that's why we're now seeing quite evident, all about goods. And we're still getting deflationary pressures. But global trade is without question now dramatically falling, as this chart here shows. And as we would expect with this hole on the other side, and in fact, our hole of demand, and in fact, it is what has panicked central banks here recently into almost historic policy reversals as they've really realized the magnitude. And it's getting worse at a tremendous rate. And here's the real rub, Charles. Services are not responding in this fashion with all this, nor should be expected to, because they have a different curve, as I'm showing here. That's because they're not elastic; they're inelastic, and for some of the reasons that we're talking about. Services themselves are not part of the industrial era. They're really about post-World War II era functions where highly trained, skilled professionals are the producers of a sellable product or service, not via automation and the associated resulting leverage. Cheap money is not nearly as important, in my mind, as attracting and keeping intellectual know-how. It is much tougher to quickly ramp up and traumatic when you're forced to scale back, and so therefore you don't. Often you pass it on. Often in the latter case, profits are sacrificed to buy time, actually, for hoping that the demand would return. But the goods manufacturers, they can't buy, they can only buy so much time unless they can just keep borrowing cheap money to stay alive. And services are also, as we talked about earlier, dominated more local or domestically. And yes, there's global service providers, but it's about small business in America, and it's dominated by, as you said, Charles, by smaller professional service providers or regional leaders. Okay, comments here, Charles?
Right, and you have a great chart here of price changes, in the consumer price index, and as distorted as it is, as you've pointed out, it's very clear that imported manufactured goods, TVs, toys, and clothing, have declined in price, where everything that cannot be offshored, like childcare, and domestic services like healthcare, those have skyrocketed. And so I want to just kind of add 2 points. Is when I first visited China in 2000, they were already in an oversupply of televisions for their domestic market. Never mind the global economy. They had too many manufacturers of TVs. They'd already built out enough manufacturing capacity to put multiple TVs in every Chinese household, and of course, never mind the export market. And so, I think a lot of people don't understand just how amazing the global supply chain is. If you need 10 million or 100 million units, that can be done, very easily. And so, the idea that you're going to grow an economy by selling more TVs when everybody's already got one or two or three, that's not happening. And so, the idea that that you can offset these inflationary things with continued deflationary impacts. We don't need to buy a TV every day, right? We buy it once a year or once every couple of years. But childcare, yard service, education, government services, we pay for these every day. And so it's really a mismatch. And then I want to make one other quick point. Other people have pointed out it takes the same number of hours today in 2019 to learn how to play piano or violin as it did in 1700, essentially. I mean, there's a few improvements here and there, but the cost of those lessons has skyrocketed because the teacher has higher costs. And so you can see how we're really talking about two economies, and we as you say, we blend them together, but they're really two different economies.
Wall Street and Main Street, and they are different economies, but we don't account and really view it. This slide here really brings it home, doesn't it, Charles? You know, the blue is everything about imported goods. And by the way, notice it's starting to flatten out here.
Yes.
And I think it'll start to rise, but it'll still probably be below the 0% line. Just you're not going to get them going down. But everything in the red is all domestic, and look at the slope of this. But you know what's not shown in this chart, because I didn't make this particular chart, is if we put all of the services, it would be a massive number of red lines going up. You know, I'm talking about plumbing rates, electrician rates, and all the things we saw in the previous slides. It doesn't show, you know, if we really showed it as a realistic basket of disposable income of the average family in America, it would truly bring it home. And I think we're going to see going forward, it'll actually start to go a little bit more exponential up on the red as the blue even starts to turn up. You know what, Charles? What I believe this is telling us here now on this chart maybe helps is we are moving towards an era of real rising inflation in price and price inflation, and falling real prices in asset inflation. That's what you'd mentioned earlier, and I really see that happening. You know, increasingly, what we need, that is, we need it, we normally pay cash for, as I've said, and so we don't finance it other than on very short-term basis, and it will steadily rise. You don't pay, as we said earlier, your plumber, your barber with long-term financing, though we do put it on a credit card. Increasingly, what we want, not need, what we want, and this is where the economy has been driven, I would argue, for the last 15 years with easy money, as we were going reflation, and then we went into the quantitative easing era. Because even after the dot-com bubble, through the two financial crises, we still had relatively low interest rates. Relatively, they weren't the level of QE. So what we wanted, we could get: bigger houses, marquee cars, exotic vacations, whatever. Even, you know, as we refinanced houses to get at the money, our mortgages. So I believe it will begin falling in price and asset values generally as property. For example, why do I say that? Property taxes, you know, which you typically don't finance, but on your house, but you know, houses will be seen as getting more expensive, even though you're financing itself. It's because the property taxes are now going through the roof. And it's not uncommon now for property taxes to be $20,000 and $30,000 for a relatively modest home in many states. And how do you retire with that kind of a property tax on a house? And then so you say, well, somebody's going to replace it. Well, they got another form of mortgage, and that's called a student loan. So it's going to change what asset value appreciation is versus what is really there, and that's price inflation. And if you have unencumbered collateral, money will probably be available and cheap. However, it will be the old adage, money is cheap when you don't need it and is scarce when you do. So this is where I think the shift is going to really occur, and is already occurring, and it's right centered on the services with that leverage and in their inelastic supply curve. Comments?
Yeah, and so I just wanted to say that I'm extremely interested in how you're tying in the inflation and deflation topics to the stock market, and you've got a great slide here of what's happened to the stock market in the United States while the Fed, you know, reduced interest rates to near zero. Of course, the stock market has shot up, but that process seems to have reached a point of exhaustion.
But never underestimate what the government and central bankers will do to keep things up. But I thought this chart here, last fall when the market was really coming down, we were looking everywhere to see where the money would be pumped in, and trying to where it was coming from. And you'll notice there, in actual fact, I got some. It was in November, December, the money started, even though it wasn't officially out there, coming into the market. And we've had charts, Charles, we've showed many times that the market has tracked exactly the money supply coming in, the growth of in actual fact, the growth of the balance sheets of the major central banks that control the four major currencies, the growth of their balance sheets and China's has correlated exactly with the increase in the stock market and generally all asset prices. The market is completely driven. Financial markets are driven and controlled right now today by the global money supply. That's a fact. But on the other hand, so even if the markets weaken, and they should be exhausted, I fully agree, because they've disconnected from fundamentals. That does not mean that the money won't be pushed out there and drive it up. We could very much see a Minsky melt up, because with the baby boomers now retiring, the pension, we have $84 trillion in unfunded liabilities associated with pensions, whether Social Security or corporate. The amount of money that's going to be needed, we're not going to default on it. There'll be means testing. That money's going to have to be borrowed, and they're going to have to print money to make those things happen. They're going to have to do something with the student loans and baby boom, or the millennials and their problem, or they're going to have a housing problem of unmitigated proportion. The bottom line, in some form, we will print the money to keep the financial assets up, or the devastation will be beyond the pale. And I don't want to see that either, and I don't support it, but they're really locked in. But that doesn't mean, so if they're holding it up, it doesn't mean that you're getting ahead, because inflation is going to eat you alive, in my opinion, as price inflation begins to arrive. And it doesn't have to be through the roof. It's all relative to what your income is going up at. Do you agree with that conclusion, Charles?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that, as you just said, it's about the standard of living declining, but at a rate that's slow enough that we're the boiled frogs, right? In other words, the loss of purchasing power, the decline in our discretionary income, it's eroding, but at a slow enough pace that there's not going to be political blowback or a demand for a systemic change. And so I think your Minsky melt-up chart is very interesting, because you point out that even though the money supply and liquidity is going through the roof, the GDP is not responding. It's actually declining, which
Precisely.
is exactly what we're seeing globally. And credit is drying up too, as the number of households and corporations which are qualified to borrow declines, because they're already over indebted. And so we're seeing we're seeing increasing monetary stimulus producing diminishing results in the real economy.
The Japan, the Bank of Japan now owns 60-70% of all ETFs that trade on the Nikkei. They own 50% or more of the Japanese bond market. We know what the Central Bank of Switzerland is buying, etc. I can go around. The central banks are already buying and participating in a massive way in the financial markets. And forget whether we, the United States, do it. They are. And that in itself is holding up even the U.S. markets. And I think at some point we will have to be much more aggressive in that fashion. Don't get me wrong, Charles. I disagree with it emphatically. I just think they have no choice. We're the decisions we should have taken 15 years ago, we didn't. Now we're only going to begin to pay the price. And we will not let the system collapse until we've done everything possible to stop it from collapsing. And as dramatic and untested as quantitative easing is, we haven't seen anything yet, in my opinion. We talk about helicopter money. Now we're hearing MMT every day. I read something on it, which is nothing more than helicopter money twisted, or what we used to call monetization, in another fashion. And as I look at, the government out of Washington appears to have this leaning towards the left now, more than I've seen in a long time. They're just going to demand that we be that we print the money to get what the things that we think we should have. It's almost like the millennial generations are used to getting what they want, and they would expect the government to do the same thing. I don't want to get political, but I was reading the Green Deal at $95 trillion, and even if that's exaggerated, it's like, pardon? Where's the reality here? Not that I'm disagreeing with green movement, but there's an attitude, is what I'm trying to say, even in our society, that we just don't worry about the debt and the consequences. And that's fine, but in a capitalist system, it doesn't work. It doesn't sustain itself. And therefore, it will be forced into probably a Minsky melt-up. So for the investors, the best time is when you actually know with pretty good confidence what they're going to be forced or what they're going to do. And that's why the hedge funds, they can see it. And the smarter ones have been really, I mean, some of the money they're taking out is almost obscene. Charles, I think that we've used up a lot of time here. I'd leave with this slide here that's called The Impact of Quantitative Easing. I've done a couple videos here recently that are up at Macro Analytics that explode this chart here in more detail, and what's going on in the overall supply chain with more charts that's available for those who might want to follow this discussion any further. Any closing comments you want to make or wrap up?
Yeah, I would say my context for our discussion today is that the global economy and the U.S. economy are changing in fundamental ways in terms of supply and demand and technology, right? And that the technological productivity that has built out the global goods supply chain has not really affected the services yet, but we are starting to see that happen, and that's going to be a revolution that cannot be stopped simply by monetary policies and monetary easing. In other words, the powers that be have used monetary policies as an attempt to reshape the economy, but the economy is going to be reshaped by the demands for productivity and lower costs. And so this is going to dramatically affect the employment and in the services, because we're going to have to start using technological innovation, such as online learning instead of going to a college campus. We're going to consult with a doctor on a video call as opposed to actually physically going to the clinic. And so these are just two examples of many where we're going to see a dramatic change in the fundamentals of services. And that's going to drive good things like innovation, but it's also going to disrupt a huge number of jobs and profitability. So we're really talking about trends that are still unfolding in the decades ahead.
Yeah, some of these comments have been a little bit doom and gloom here. We will. It's just to some degree, some of this is going to be a catalyst for major societal changes that we now have the technology to take advantage of. And sometimes we need a good shove to make those changes, because I believe there's going to be all sorts of, the same way as we figured out how to automate goods, we're going to figure out how to deliver services in same as we automated online retailing. We're going to figure out a way of doing services in even more productive fashion. But who's going to be? The question is, who's going to be the winners and losers? Because there's going to be a lot of pain, and all these things, Charles, point I'd leave is all cut back the number of jobs. And I know population demographics have been falling off, but there's just not enough high-paying jobs that are really being created. And this is a wave for another show, but this is a wave that we haven't even begun to understand, of how the global economy is going to support the population with livable wages in terms of jobs. That's it, Charles, for me here today. Do you want to tell our listeners where they can read a lot of your work that you write on a lot of these subjects?
Right. Please visit me at of2minds.com, and I've got free samples of my most recent books and a lot of other stuff in my archives.
Charles, thank you very much, and we'll have another great discussion next month. Talk to you then.
Okay. Thank you, Gordon.
Thanks. Bye.